Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating today and joining us for the webinar, which will answer the question, are we deploying enough renewable energy fast enough to keep us below 2 degrees global warming? For those of you who are not familiar with IRENA, we are an intergovernmental organization that supports countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future. We promote the widespread adoption and sustainable use of all forms of renewable energy, including bioenergy, geothermal, hydropower, ocean, solar, and wind energy, in the pursuit of sustainable development, energy security, and a stable climate. IRENA serves as a network hub, an advisory resource, and an authoritative, unified global voice for renewable energy. IRENA has 143 members in 29 states in the process of becoming members. For today's webinar, you have two options for listening in. You may connect by computer by selecting mic and speakers, or by phone by selecting the telephone option in the right-hand panel. If you should face any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact the GoToWebinar help desk at the number provided on your screen. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. From Greenpeace International, Ms. Emily Rochon will be presenting the Greenpeace Energy Revolution report. For the solar industry, we have Mr. Oliver Schaefer, President of the Solar Power Europe organization. From the wind energy industry, we have Steve Sawyer, Secretary General of the Global Wind Energy Council. And from the bioenergy industry, we have Gerard Ostheimer, Global Lead for Sustainable Bioenergy Group for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. We once again like to thank you for your participation, and I will hand over the microphone now to my colleague Christian Kjaer.
Thank you, Ismail, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Just trying to put today's debate into its right context, as Ismail said. We're trying to ask the question whether we are deploying renewables fast enough, which indicates that we actually do believe it's going fast. The question is it fast enough? We are only 4 days. We're going to have an introduction, which is what I'm giving here. The IRENA remap options will be presented, Greenpeace Energy Revolution. We will then have brief survey results that we send out to 6,500 people prior to this webinar, and we'll then get the industry perspective on whether they can deliver, and if so, what sort of policy measures they would need to deliver in order to stay below 2 degrees global warming. COP21 is going to start in only a few days, and we also hope that we can cement the climate agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and avoid the worst consequences of climate change. We have seen governments providing their plans for what they intend to do, and depending on who you ask, those plans will have a significant impact on reducing emissions, but it's also clear that they're not going to be enough yet to stay below 2 degrees. There are estimates of anything from 2.7 degrees to 4 degrees global warming in the year 2100 if we are following what we're seeing. Now, renewables will play a major role in the climate solution, and today we'll discuss how big that role will be, how renewable energy relates to the climate targets, and whether industry can deliver. We from IRENA has launched a report on renewable energy and climate change just 2 days ago, and you'll find some of our analysis included in that report, which will also be launched in Paris. Now, there's a lot of figures out there, and it can be a bit confusing in terms of how they relate to each other. The 2 degree Celsius target is basically the headline figure. This is what countries have committed to, and this is what the scientists are saying, that we need to be below in order to avoid the worst consequences of global warming. Some people are saying 1.5 degrees would be better. We're currently at a global warming level of about 0.8 degrees. There's also references in the current text and discussions in the debate about how much greenhouse gas general consensus is, 40 to 70% by the mid of the century compared to 2010, and then to zero by the year 2100. Now, there's also a lot of talk about our carbon budget. It is generally thought that we've used up 2/3 of our carbon budget, and we have about 1,000 gigatons left before we head towards a significant climate change. And one of the problems is that we have, of the third, we have less than 1,000 gigatons, perhaps 70 to 80% of the remaining budget we have in terms of carbon emissions is already locked in to existing power plants. And this is really, really a big challenge for the energy sector. We have a significant amount of scenarios that say that we cannot produce a 2-degree trajectory if we go above 55 gigatons of emissions per year. We're about 50 gigatons at the moment. So these are the projections that we're currently seeing. By 2100, 4.1 to 4.8 degrees, which is clearly going to have a massive impact on our climate and our lives. The current policy projections come out at about 3.3 to 3.8 degrees, which is clearly also too much. We need to get to a trajectory of 2 degrees, and as I said, in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions, we should aim to stay below certainly 55 gigatons of CO2. The INDCs, the plans that the governments have issued, will take us somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees at the moment. This is, in the short term, what needs to be done. Total greenhouse gas emission needs to be below 55 gigatons, and we need to reduce that dramatically. Now, this is all greenhouse gas emissions, and clearly the energy sector cannot deliver this gap of 12 to 14 that we are seeing here in total emissions. Today, we have to assume that the other non-energy parts of the sector are going to deliver theirs. We have to focus on the energy-related emissions, and they're about 2/3 of the total emissions, so about 30 gigatons are related to energy emissions, and that's going to be the focus of our discussion here today. Now, renewables are growing fast, and this is just to give you an idea. We're comparing, this was the data we could find that far back, but basically this shows you the historic development of nuclear, wind energy, and solar PV, and it took nuclear about 18 years to get from 2.5 gigawatt total installed capacity to 150 gigawatt. It took wind energy 16 years, so 2 years less, and PV has actually done it in only 11 years. It's important to note that a gigawatt of nuclear produces about 2 to 3 times as much energy as a gigawatt of wind or PV, but it does show that it is possible to scale the technologies quite significantly. This is basically the annual increases we're seeing, and we're seeing that if you add PV and wind together, it's growing at about 100 gigawatts per year at the moment, and that is significant also if you talk about electricity. The scenarios that will be presented today is the IRENA's remap options and Greenpeace's energy revolution. We have taken those two scenarios or options, and also in this graph you can see the IEA's 450 ppm scenario, and in terms of annual increase in capacity compared to the actual 2014 installations. And what you'll see, of course, is that for all the technologies except hydro, all these scenarios are assuming that the average increase in capacity exceeds what we did last year, and this is what we're going to hear more in detail about going forward today. renewable energy there's a lot of myths out there about renewable energy, and there's also a lot of increased evidence that these myths are not false. It's clear that renewable energy are not marginal, they're not expensive. They do have an impact on the environment, but compared to other technologies, it's insignificant. They're certainly not unreliable, and you have now energy systems that are having very large shares of renewable energy in their system. So this was my introduction, and I'll now hand over to Deger Saygin, who's going to introduce the IRENA scenarios, the remap options, and relate that to today's discussions. Please, Deger.
Thank you very much, Christian. My name is Deger Saygin. I'm working at IRENA's remap team. And as Christian mentioned, I will be presenting some slides from the IRENA's work on remap 2030, a renewable energy roadmap. Remap is IRENA's global renewable energy roadmap, which looks at doubling the renewable energy share in the global energy mix. It's an roadmap which explores the potential, cost, and benefits of doubling the renewable energy share in the global energy mix. It's a technology options analysis. It's not a target setting exercise. It's not a options analysis. It's an options analysis. It's not a scenario analysis. It's a technology options analysis, and each technology option is characterized by their costs and potentials. It focuses on the entire energy system, not only on the power generation sector. It looks at the district heating, it looks at the end-use sectors, and that means heating, cooling, and transport sectors. It covers at the moment 40 countries and 80% of the global energy use. The cornerstone of the approach is that it's developed together with national experts nominated by the countries, and it's also validated by the country experts. It's not an analysis of IRENA only, it's a joint work of IRENA together with the countries. Some of the key findings from IRENA's remap analysis are provided in this slide. We have released the first edition of the Renewable Energy Roadmap in June 2014. And the roadmap has shown that doubling the renewable energy share in the global energy mix is technically achievable with existing technologies, so existing renewable energy technologies. Especially high shares of renewables in the power generation sector can be achieved, but more attention is needed in the heating, cooling, and transportation sectors. Doubling is affordable, especially when externalities related to the avoided fossil fuels are accounted for. If you look at today's energy prices, such externalities are not necessarily reflected. And there are further benefits of renewables, such as macroeconomic benefits, that including jobs, better economic activity, human health benefits, cleaner environment, as well as improved energy security. What is also important from these findings was that there's a potential in all countries to contribute to the doubling renewable energy share. Now let's have a look at the carbon dioxide emission related findings of this analysis. Today, or in the base year of this analysis, the CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel energy combustion was about 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide. This is only the carbon dioxide. It does not include the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. If the countries follow a business as usual, so what the countries think they would do if, based on their national plans, the total global CO2 emissions would reach about 41, 42 gigatons by 2030. This is shown at the second bar here on this figure, as at the top. That's the top top level of this figure. So that's about 41.4 gigatons of CO2 emissions. If the technology options that were identified in the analysis were to be implemented by 2030, the total global CO2 emissions would reach can be reduced by about 8.6. So that's the potential of renewables. If we are also to implement the potential of the energy efficiency measures on top of the renewable energy technologies, another reduction gigatons of 7.3 gigatons can be achieved. So together, the potential of renewables and energy efficiency can reduce the total CO2 emissions in 2030 to about 25 gigatons, and that would be sufficient to put the world on a path to keep the global temperature rise to about 2 degrees Celsius. And the role of renewables and energy efficiency are more or less the same to achieve this potential by 2030. Now let's look at the technology by technology potentials. And let's start with the power sector and what's happening in the renewable energy technologies and power generation sector. This is showing the historical trends and what we are seeing in terms of the renewable energy technology deployment for renewables, of course, but also for non-renewables, so fossil fuel and nuclear. In the past 2 years, the total amount of additions from the renewable energy technologies have exceeded the total additions of the fossil and nuclear. This is an important finding, and especially in 2014, 60% of the total new power generation capacity was from renewable energy technologies. It has reached about its 130 gigawatts additions in 2014. And to put that historical trend into perspective to 2030, and what we've estimated in REMAP, as the heading of this slide identifies, there are opportunities in the power generation sector that is underestimated in the country plans. This is the trend we've seen. According to REMAP, there's a potential to reach 44% renewable energy share in the power generation sector. And how does the breakdown of that share is by technology? This figure shows by technology how much each can grow between 2011 and 2030, according to the business as usual reference case or REMAP 2030. When you look at the difference between the square and the triangles, for each technology there is a large gap. The square identifies the business as usual. The triangle is the REMAP 2030 potential. Especially for solar and wind onshore, there's a potential which is not covered in the country plans. But if we are to implement the potential of solar and wind by 2030, solar capacity can reach about 1250 gigawatts, and wind onshore potential total installed capacity can reach about 1400 gigawatts by 2030. And this implies a need to grow installed each year additions by 67 gigawatts and 85 gigawatts per year for solar and wind respectively in the period between today and 2030. And are these two technologies on track? Are wind and solar on track? Yes, they are. And this is in this figure we show that. You see the more dark shaded figures are showing the trends in the historical trends until 2014, and the rest shows the trends if we are to follow REMAP 2030. Already we have reached about 50 gigawatt additions for wind and about 39 gigawatt additions for solar PV in 2014. And if we are to follow REMAP 2030, there is only by 2020 we can reach these current levels, and with some increases after 2020 to 2030, we can reach the REMAP 2030 potentials. Solar and wind are both on track compared to historical trends, but some efforts will still be required to accelerate these additions by about 50% compared to current or historic levels, but they are still quite good and very well on track to reach the REMAP 2030 potentials. Now let's take a look at the potential in the transport sector. This figure shows the historical trends in liquid biofuels for conventional ethanol, conventional biodiesel, advanced diesel, and advanced ethanol, and what the potentials are for 2020 and 2030. Today's production levels of liquid biofuels is about 128 billion liters. And if we are to follow the REmap 2030 potential, there is a potential to realize about 500 billion liters of liquid biofuels in the transport sector. That would take the renewable energy share in transport sector to about 12% compared to 3% today. That's a quadrupling in the renewable energy share, as well as a quadrupling in the total liquid biofuel production in the same period. So in 16 years, we can go from 128 to 500 billion liters production in total liquid biofuels. And if you look at the total advanced biofuel, the contribution of the advanced biofuel is about 25% in 2030 to the total liquid biofuel market, and that's about 125 billion liters. The current level of advanced bioethanol and biodiesel production is less than a billion liters. So the effort there is about 100 times. And if you look at the historical trends of the transport biofuels, the production has increased up to 2010, but it has stayed more or less the same since 2010 up to today. So biofuel production is at the moment flat. And to realize these potentials in 2030, a lot of effort will be required in the transport sector, in the biofuel markets. To conclude the findings from this presentation, there are some efforts required to stay at the path for 2 degrees Celsius global temperature increase. If you look at the power sector, wind and solar PV are both on track. As we've seen in the transport sector, some efforts will be required. I didn't show the efforts needed in the heating cooling sector, but solar thermal for water heating is in the building sector is also well on track, but modern renewables and electrification for heating and especially the manufacturing industry will require further focus if we are to reach a doubling of the global renewable energy share. And these were the slides which look at the global picture, but there is much more work we are doing at the country level for these 40 countries, and we started releasing since last year country-specific roadmaps, which you can find online on our webpage, www.remap. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Deger. And our next speaker is Emily Rochon from Greenpeace International. And she will present the energy revolution scenario, which is a scenario that has been around for a long time and which depicts a world of increasing renewables. Emily, the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear me? Hello? Okay, great. Just checking. Thanks, Christian. So I'm going to very briefly highlight today the primary results of our Energy Revolution report. We've been doing these reports at Greenpeace since 2005, striving as technology changes to show that 100% renewable energy future is possible in order to save the climate. In our most recent report, for the first time, we advance a scenario that does in fact show 100% renewable electricity, energy, and heat and transport is possible by 2050. Standing here today where 19% of our primary energy demand is met by renewable energy, we have a long way to go to 100%, but as our scenario shows, it's both technically and economically feasible to get there in time and to stay below the 2-degree target. As Christian mentioned in his introduction, there's lots of numbers thrown around for climate scenarios and how much we can emit or not emit, but the 1,000 gigaton target that we have with only 1,000 gigatons of carbon left to emit, it current rates will blow that budget by 2040. So there's certainly a need to rapidly reduce carbon emissions in the energy sector because it currently accounts for 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And renewable energy is certainly up to the task if we only are able to accelerate deployment. So I'll just briefly review the methodology before discussing some of the key findings. Our Energy Revolution report is different, for example, from an International Energy Agency forecast, where they're forecasting potential future renewable energy uptake based on current and anticipated conditions. As you might have seen over the years, IEA has been wildly off base when it comes to actually predicting the uptake of renewable energy in the various countries and across the planet, whereas the Greenpeace scenario has been far more accurate. And our approach is more of a backcasting approach, where we quantify a long-term target and then push the technologies as far as we can in order to get to where we need to go in that time frame. And that approach, at least to date, has been far more accurate in predicting deployment of wind, solar, and other renewable energy technologies. In our latest report, we have 3 scenarios that we put forth. A reference scenario being based on the International Energy Agency World Energy Outlook 2012 report, which we extrapolate the results from their 2030 outcome all the way out to 2050. We have a basic energy revolution scenario, which I won't discuss much at all today, but you can read more about it in the report. That gets the world to 80% emission reductions by 2050 and a final share of 83% of renewable energy and primary energy demand. And then we have our advanced energy revolution scenario, which gets the world to 100% renewable energy by 2050. We have a lot of parameters and assumptions and data that go into modeling our various scenarios. The report itself is over 300 pages, so I can't go into all the various gory details, but basically some of the primary parameters that go into our methodology, of course, first and foremost, is getting to the 0% emission reduction target by 2050. Then we choose our various renewable energy efficiency, storage, and grid technologies. We're essentially using only proven technologies, off-the-shelf technologies in our report, nothing that's theoretical. And by doing so, we show that from today's standpoint, 100% renewable energy is possible, but of course, as technology changes over the time, we might be able to get there even faster than we can currently forecast and at an even lower cost. Once we've chosen our renewable energy and other technologies, we take into account resource limits, putting wind where wind makes sense and putting solar where the sun is actually shining. We account for various drivers of demand in our scenario, so we do take into account population growth as well as economic development. And in our scenario, we assume universal access. So the 1 billion people that currently don't have access to electricity in the world today do have access to electricity in 2050. We also developed the energy intensities for the various sectors: heating, transport, industry, residential, and then establish our timelines for implementation. So moving into the key results for our scenario, I'm sure it comes as no surprise, as I've already said, that our report shows quite clearly that 100% renewable energy is possible by 2050 across all sectors. You'll see in this graph that we're presenting the results from all 3 scenarios: the reference, the basic energy revolution, and the advanced energy revolution. By 2050, we've significantly reduced energy demand by fully leveraging the potential of energy efficiency technologies, modal shifts in the transport sector, and moving more of our heating and transport demand to electricity using much more efficient technologies. But we rely on a mix of renewable energy resources to power the rest of the economy and keep the lights on, including ocean energy, geothermal, solar PV, concentrated solar power, biomass, wind, and hydro. And by getting to 100% renewable energy by 2050, we of course managed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 0% in the time frame needed. In our scenario, you end up emitting about 667 gigatons of carbon by 2050. So we're well within the 1,000 gigaton budget that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The reference scenario, on the other hand, increases emissions by 56%, and it has emitted 1,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide by the time you get to 2040. And in our view, while you might hear other perspectives that, well, you know, we don't have to reduce emissions to 0% until 2100, we have another 50 years, this is far too aggressive, we've got more time than you're suggesting. Greenpeace would respectfully disagree for a couple of reasons. One, given the enormous environmental and public health impacts of fossil fuel combustion beyond just climate change, it's certainly worthwhile to try to phase out these energy sources as quickly as possible. Two, given the challenges associated outside of the energy sector in terms of reducing emissions, the sooner we can reduce emissions to get down to 0% in the energy sector, the more room we have to try to get things right in the other sectors. And so if we can do it by 2050, we absolutely should. Just looking at the power sector a bit more in detail, I don't talk too much in this presentation about the transport and heating sector, but again, all of that information is available online in the report. You can see there's a dramatic increase in installed capacity for renewable energy. That's primarily due to the fact that renewable energy in the electricity sector becomes our primary fuel. We do shift a lot of our heating demand and transport demand in our scenario to electricity, and as a result we have to increase consumption in the electricity sector despite energy efficiency to meet that increased demand. So for example, you see in the 2012 reference scenario we're at 97 gigawatts of solar PV. I think we're at about 177 gigawatts today, or in 2014, so we've already increased dramatically from there. But by the time 2050 rolls around, in our advanced scenario, we need to be well over 9,000 gigawatts of PV. Fortunately, as has already been mentioned, solar PV is a very quick technology to deploy. So these numbers are absolutely feasible if the right policy, environment, and political will is there to advance it. The other good news about our scenario, in addition to being safe and helpful for tackling climate change, is that the energy revolution costs less than business as usual. While the upfront investment costs of the energy revolution scenario are higher than the business as usual approach, that increased cost is more than offset by the fuel cost savings in our scenario. So you'll see here that the additional money, the annual investment that we would have to spend in order to get to 100%, 1,000% too, we could also try that in our next report, but 100% by 2050 is offset by fuel cost savings. And this is important. The point to make here as well is that in this scenario, we're not putting a price on carbon. So we're already ahead of the game in terms of economics without pricing carbon. So you can imagine if you're living in a country or a region of the world where there is a price on carbon, further internalizing the externalities of fossil fuels, then the economic case is even greater. But Greenpeace shows that you can beat the business as usual scenario on an economic basis without even putting a price on carbon. And then the sort of third leg of good news in our scenario is we modeled employment impacts as well. And we show in our scenario that every step of the way there are more jobs in a renewable energy future than there are in staying with business as usual. So we modeled 45.2 million jobs in our 100% scenario versus almost half that, 29.1 million jobs in our reference scenario. And again, we're already seeing evidence of this across the world in countries that have started to deploy renewables to a substantial level. For example, in the US, there's already far more jobs in the solar PV sector than there is in the coal sector. So given all of the rosy projections and the results of our scenario, really, how do you get to 100% renewable energy by 2050 in order to stay below 2 degrees warming? Well, in the Greenpeace scenario, we phase out fossil fuels according to this timeline. Lignite, which is the most carbon intensive of the fossil fuels, is phased out by 2035. We phase out coal 10 years later, and oil and gas are finally phased out at 2050. Also in our scenario, we don't assume any new offshore drilling, and existing oil fields and coal mines are exhausted and then shut down. We further phase out nuclear power by 2050, not assuming any new construction for nuclear power on the planet in that time frame. We dramatically reduce energy demand while making sure that everyone has access to electricity. In our 2050 scenario, we are 15% below current levels in terms of our energy demand by the 2050. And to underscore a bit more what that means for the heating and transport sector, since I haven't focused on those a bit much in this presentation, in our advanced energy revolution scenario, energy efficiency measures are able to reduce global heating demand by 33% in 2050 relative to our reference scenario. For the transport sector, energy demand is decreased by 62% compared to the reference scenario, partly because of the shift towards electricity as a mode of transport, and also, looking more into modal shifts, rail to road or road to rail, rather, and assuming better planning in cities so people don't always have to get into their car in order to go to the grocery store. We massively increase the use of renewables, as I've shown, and to get a bit more detail on transport and heating, so 53% of our electricity sector, or of our transport demands, are directly met by electricity, and in the heating sector, it's 19% of electricity demand. And then, of course, finally, as I'm sure we all know, we have to leverage storage, smart grids, energy imports and exports, and demand-side management to balance the 24/7 renewable grid and make sure the lights stay on whenever they're needed. So I think the key takeaways from the Greenpeace scenario are money, jobs, and climate. Our scenario shows that renewable energy is cheaper to deploy than a business-as-usual approach. You'll also have more jobs than continuing to build fossil fuel power plants, which will translate into greater economic development opportunities across the planet. And in fact, going to 0% energy emissions in the energy sector by 2050 is really the only way to stay below 2 degrees warming. And in our view, to answer the question whether we're moving fast enough to deploy renewable energy technologies, the answer is no. Yes, we're doing pretty good in the electricity sector, but we certainly need to do more. And in countries across the world that started deployment of renewable energy technologies well before others, there's a risk of backsliding and backlash as utilities are fighting against the transition to 100% renewable energy future. So we certainly need to stay vigilant and make sure that governments follow through on the commitments that they've made, both for renewable energy and climate change. But then, of course, also ensure that there's focus on the transport and heating sectors where very little progress has been made over the past few decades to deploy carbon-free and more energy-efficient technologies. So we certainly need to ensure that the infrastructure, for example, is put in place for electric vehicles, and that the sort of support schemes we've seen for renewable electricity technologies are similarly put in place for renewable heating and cooling technologies. And that basically sums up the points I had to make today. The 300+ page Energy Revolution report is available for everyone online. Please take a moment to peruse through that after this webinar to get into some of the more detailed issues that I didn't have time to cover today. And of course, if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Emily. And before we hear from the industry, because there's clearly placed a lot of faith in your ability to ramp up production to meet the climate targets, both from Greenpeace and from IRENA's scenarios and options. We did a short survey in IRENA last week where we asked 6,000 people and got a response rate of about 10%, whether today's renewables are capable of replacing fossil fuels. 70% said that it is, and we asked whether it's being deployed fast enough, and 83% agreed with what Emily was just saying, that it's not happening fast enough, and especially outside of the electricity sector. And we then asked which of the what would be needed in order to keep us below 2 degrees. And interestingly, the participants did not believe that it was a technical constraint. There was only 14% saying that, or even a public awareness issue. It was really about creating incentives in the form of political actions and removing outright disincentives, for instance, in the form of fossil fuel subsidies. These were the responses we got from this little mini survey we did prior to this. I'll now turn to our industry representatives to hear whether they are indeed able to ramp up production as indicated by these scenarios. And the first we'll hear from is Mr. Oliver Kjaer, who's the president of Solar Power Europe, who is representing the PV industry in the European Union.
Hello, it's Oliver. You hear me all? I unfortunately cannot show my screen.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Can you show my presentation from your screen? I cannot do it from here. For whatever reason, it says my presentation is corrupted. I guess you see my email screen. Whatever, I can do it without a moment. Just give it a second, and before it uploads, it's great to hear all your voices again. Haven't heard them for a while, Christian, particularly yours. And Emily, I'll criticize a little bit of what you said as the first co-author of the Energy Revolution Scenario. I think I'm allowed to do that, but the criticism will be a pretty positive one. So I hope you allow me doing that. So is it working now or not?
Yeah,
I think
we have it up here now, Oliver.
So you can see the screen? Ah, okay.
It should be okay now.
Okay. Okay, if you can move to slide 1 then, please. Because I cannot move anything. So whatever, I believe, I mean, the answer to your question that you asked for is renewables fast enough to stay below the 2 degrees global warming scenario. I believe renewables definitely can do. To start with, I think we just need to move away from where we were 10 years ago and what we did the last 10 years into the next step. Okay, one slide before, please. We need, I mean, to start with, we need to move from what we did 10 years ago to say, like, we need to set goals for renewable energies. We need to agree on policies, particularly for renewable energies. I think we can move in the next step because we have proven that renewable energies, particularly PV and wind, because that's what reality is, have proven to be even quicker than what was anticipated by the biggest optimists. PV now has a capacity of over 220 gigawatt by the end of this year, and we are continuing with that increase of technology installations. What we have to do now, what we have to do next, is to move away from talking about we create a niche for renewable energies, we work in our niche and we create targets for renewables and see how we can fit in renewable energies, particularly wind and solar, into a 100-year-old system which was made for big chunks of baseload technology that were running 24 hours a day. And what we have as a biggest threat to the climate is coal, at first, to me. So what we have to do is get rid of coal, not talking about how to integrate small amounts of wind and PV into the 100-year-old system that was made for coal particularly. No, we need to stop the use of coal, and much before what Emily just presented in the Greenpeace Energy Revolution scenario. If we stop coal and if we create a new system that is not rewarding a 24 hours running old school technology like coal, that is dirty, that is unsustainable, is inflexible, we need to move away from that and say like, no, the new basis of our energy system will not be this inflexible, unsustainable source, but it will be new sources such as wind and solar. Yes, they are sort of volatile but very predictable, but they are the new basis of the system. And what we need to do is create policies around that support this system. So move away from trying to set goals for renewables to say like the new basis of our electricity system, and by that much more also our transport and heating system, is solar and wind. And we add flexible technologies to that. Flexible technologies can come from demand and storage management, from software solutions. The big new players in energy markets, I guarantee you in a couple of years, will be the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks of this world. They're investing heavily at this day, billions of dollars into wind and solar, not because they want to be operators of wind and solar farms, they don't care about that, but they want to learn how to create a software that is necessary to steer all these technologies that are sort of volatile, that need a demand and supply side management. This is what they do. And if you look at the young population, what they know is not their electricity supplier around the neighborhood or the big utility. What they know and what they grow up with is Facebook, Google, and Apple and things like that. And so they will automatically stay with these technologies once they move out and have their own flag. If Apple and Google come and say like, look, we have a solution for you, a solution for all your energy needs, we will take care of everything, they will say yes. Because if RWE or E.ON or Iberdrola comes and says like, we offer you electricity and energy, they say like, I never heard about you. So I think things may even happen faster than they did in the past if these new giants come in and supply energy needs. Same thing is true also for transport. It's not just electricity. The transport sector is a hen and egg problem. I myself would love to drive an electric car. I live in 2 cities, Berlin and Brussels. I can't, because there are no charging stations. But what about thinking about a different future? Induction. We don't need cables to charge batteries at the moment, so why not charging my car at every red traffic light I'm standing there? Why is not every traffic light a charging station for my car? Thinking that future, it comes in a different way. And renewables, particularly wind and solar, are free technologies, smart free, CO2 free, and so you can deploy them also for other sectors than the electricity sectors. And if we move away and say the electricity sector's baseline cost is wind and solar, we need these flexible technologies, but the basis first of all we recognize is wind and solar, and we move away from the inflexible technologies. And if we phase out coal, and yes, flexible technologies might mean for quite a while to come also very high and modern gas turbines and gas plants, I'm fine with that if we replace coal immediately, much faster than foreseen also in the energy revolution scenario. But they can offer flexibility that is needed for wind and solar. I'm fine with that, because that will bring us much closer to the 2 degrees scenario than before. If you move to the next slide, you also see that we are now at the brink. I mean, we can, within 10 years, we have built up a couple of percentages, from nothing, a couple of percentages of penetration of solar in years, but now we are also at the crossroads here. In Europe, we are standing at a point where we say it doesn't work anymore to integrate more of these technologies, these modern technologies, into the old systems like we did. No, in Europe we need to find an answer how to go to the next step, to not integrate again into the old system, but to create a new system. Think about the telecommunications sector. 20 years ago, they sold us for low quality minute prices calls. Now they offer communication services. And that's what I foresee, offer energy services, companies that offer energy services in all sectors, across all sectors. And then we can deploy even faster than where we are today. Next slide, please. So, and this matches what Emily just said, I mean, what we need for that. In a base case scenario, we come to the installation, an annual installation of more than 1,500 gigawatt of solar PV annually, and using this not just for the electricity sector, but for transport and heating as well. And the same is true for wind, but we could even go faster. That's what we foresee, and that's also based, like in the energy revolution scenario, on the data that we know from the past. So it's not a dream that we are building up. It is based on realities over the last 10 years when deployment has happened much faster than we anticipated. And coming back to what I said at the beginning, I'm one of the co-authors of the first energy revolution. I was mainly skeptical about the growth of PV, but I accepted it, what we did, and my hesitation with PV was overcome by the reality. We are much faster than what I anticipated 10 years ago is possible, and I believe now that we can do what is projected here. Next slide, please. This is showing the Greenpeace scenario. I mean, just referring to it, PV is also in this scenario one of the strongest growth potential technologies that we have. Compare it to the next slide with the IEA scenario. The IEA has usually been proven to be wrong in their forecasts. Being it wind or solar, the last 10 years, the IEA's energy outlook was always very far from realities. They ignored it, also because the IEA has a role to protect what is there. There is a huge interest in protecting the old system, but what I do want politicians to understand, and also businessmen, do not try to protect the past of the last 100 years, try to forge the future with a totally new system. That's where we want to go. And then we will beat easily the projections from the IEA as we did the last 10 years in reality already. And if you look at the next slide, we can move a long way also in terms of prices. And Emily said this rightly. I mean, the energy revolution scenario from Greenpeace at the end looks to be cheaper than just continuing in a business as usual scenario. I mean, there is a reason why coal suppliers do nearly free of charge, spend for third world countries or other countries nearly for free plants for coal production, because they know these countries or these areas will be dependent for the next 30 to 40 years on their coal production and the coal use. So we need to move away from that, and with the new numbers we can show in PV, we can do that easily. We can supply in most of the places already today cheaper electricity at least, or translated also in cheaper energy than most other technologies, at least compared to conventional technologies such as coal. And what that means for policy, you see on the next slides, how to get there. I mean, we had, in the past, we had this approach of determining the future of the energy mix in countries. I think we are now at a time where we can be brave enough to say we don't necessarily need to determine that. If we change the way we act, it's going to determine automatically that the future energy mix will be based on wind and solar particularly. Because if we create a system that rewards no marginal cost technologies, no CO2 or CO2-free technologies, and at the same time rewards flexibility that goes hand in hand with it, we have a totally different system that will grow and grow and will automatically reward particularly wind and solar in the mix of energy. So we don't need to predetermine necessarily, globally at least. We can just let it run, and it will automatically, because the prices are so cheap. It makes sense. It's the economy stupid, as Clinton said. It makes sense to invest in PV and wind instead of investing in coal. And if we add on this, and this is where I disagree a bit on the energy revolution scenario also, we need to add a price on coal, or on CO2, not on coal and CO2. If we do that and add a serious price globally on CO2, we will even further make sure that wind and solar grow instead of others. And with others, I mean, also inefficient gas power plants. We will have a revolution in the transport sector as well. As said, this is just, to me, a hen and egg problem, but we can overcome that. The technology is there. We just need to give it an incentive. And the incentive, to me, we can make from a different perspective, not from the perspective of incentivizing these clean and sustainable technologies, but de-incentivizing the dirty, inflexible technologies, particularly coal at the very beginning. And if we replace coal in the next 15 years by solar and wind, we go a very long way to meet the CO2 targets that we are discussing about. Next slide, please. And what you see is the falling cost of PV. It has fallen by 75% over the last years. Particularly the module prices have fallen. They will continue to fall, but still you have installation prices, the so-called BOS prices. But we can beat any other technology also on that now with what we have. And if you jump over the next slide and just show the last one, so that I finish. The next one, please. Continue. There's a couple of, that's one technology, PV, which is feasible for any alternative you need. It is there for distributed generation on rooftops or wherever you need it. It's feasible for off-grid technologies or smart grid technologies. You can use it anywhere in the world, not necessarily in the north of Finland, but there you might have a lot of wind there. But you can use it nearly everywhere for cheap prices now. You need just to allow self-consumption. But even if you say, yes, for quite some time we need the grids, we create an additional income stream for grid operators by saying, like, yes, self-consuming households also use the grid, they pay something for it. But it needs to be fair and transparent and creates an income stream for grid operators as well, because they're losing a lot of money also with the system change. So why not having them around and also awarding them with something? But it needs to be fair and transparent. So new business models, new companies will come in, and the future will not be guys or kids or older people digging coal from the ground. The future will be new jobs in new systems that create a sustainable future and sustainable business. We have seen the announcement by the UK, for example, to phase out coal soon. Well, I hope they are true. And they will do it. And if we continue doing that, we will go a long way. NPV is also feasible, of course, for large-scale systems. My company that I'm working for, SunPower, is building at the moment a nearly 700 megawatt power plant in the US, which replaces big old centralized power plants. So the future will not be decentralized. Also, big offshore wind farms are not a decentralized technology. So the future is not just decentralized. The future is a more decentralized power mix with new technologies that are sustainable. As said in the very beginning, let's change the system to make the system work for a new and brighter, sustainable future instead of trying to integrate new and smart technologies into a 100-year-old system. Then we go a much longer way than discussing how we can integrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, hello, Kjaer. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Secretary General of the Global Wind Energy Council, Mr. Steve Sawyer.
Okay, it says that I'm unmuted, and I'm showing my screen. Are you seeing my screen? Is anyone seeing my screen? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Oliver, good to hear your voice again as well after a long time, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to focus and try to go quickly through here because I know we're running out of time. Just very briefly, Global Wind Energy Council is a trade association, and this is whom we represent, both major industry players but also trade associations from around the world. If you look at the story of the wind energy installed capacity since 1997, we have 18-year average growth rates of about 25%. Last year it was 16%. Those numbers will inevitably go down as our total volumes get larger. But I think this speaks to the question of fast enough. I think we have been growing fast enough so far. The question will be how to ramp that up in the future to meet the very aggressive targets, for instance, in the Energy Revolution Advanced Scenario. If you look at the annual markets, you can see precisely how we were in fact impacted by the financial crisis, because essentially in global terms we had flat markets from 2009 to 2013. The blip in 12 and 13 was as a result of the vagaries of the machinations of the US Congress, but both the US market and the global market rebounded substantially in 2014, installing over 50 gigawatts in a single year for the first time. And we would expect that to be the new floor from which we will only go upwards. I used to be able to say that we had three main regions, main markets in the world that were roughly in balance, Asia, Europe, and North America. But over the last 4 or 5 years, Asia has come to dominate, with Asia having surpassed the European Union in terms of total cumulative installed capacity during 2014, and it's only right, I suppose, since that's where the largest quantity of energy demand increase is happening, and it's also a very much the largest one of these regions in terms of the global population. Recent development, which I welcome certainly, is the appearance of Latin America beginning to grow very rapidly. That's mostly on the basis of what's happening in Brazil, but not only Brazil. And I'll come to the new markets that we're looking at a little bit further down the road in this presentation. These were the short-term market forecasts that we did at the beginning of this year. We were anticipating growth of relatively small in percentage terms, getting up to 53.5 gigawatts in 2015, but the preliminary analysis looks like that could have been way too conservative. Wouldn't be the first time, but it's better to be too conservative than too optimistic in these things. But the one consultant report came out just a few weeks ago talking about 59 gigawatts installed in 2015. I would say 56 or 57 is more realistic, but that's mostly on the strength of China and also on a reasonably good year in the US. But in terms of the overall trajectory of the industry for the rest of the decade, unless something unforeseen and very positive comes out of Paris, I think this is sort of a good base case as far as we're concerned, getting up to annual installations over 60 gigawatts by 2018 and getting up to a total installed capacity of somewhere between 650 and 700 gigawatts by the end of this decade, which is certainly well ahead of the remap track, and I believe, at least at this stage, is roughly in line with the Global Energy Revolution Advanced Scenario. I can't understate, both for 2014 and 2015, the important role and unforeseen role 10 years ago that China has played in the global market. For most of the last 5 years, with the exception of 2012, installing more than 40% of the global total. And we were very surprised to see China installing 23 gigawatts of new wind power in 2014 and expected it to go down in 2015, but having just returned from our annual show, conference and exhibition in Beijing last month, it looks like the Chinese market will increase again. There has to be an end to it sometime, but I'm not sure when. The policy environment there and also the demand from the public to and from business to clean up the air is overwhelming, and the wind industry is now well established, and solar PV is growing at very dramatic rates in China as well, and also dominating the global market. We have been, in one form or another, since 1999, working as the wind industry with Greenpeace International to develop long-term scenarios. This is the latest iteration, which was last year's, the 2014 Global Wind Energy Outlook. All of the graphics and reports are available on our website. I think the important thing to note here, the important thing to note here is that on the current trajectory, we would be somewhere close to the, certainly ahead of the remap scenario, in our advanced scenario by 2030, but not quite up to the level of the energy revolution advanced scenario by 2030. It's not the question that we're not technologically capable of it. I mean, we can produce as many turbines as the market demands, but it really is the market conditions and also the siting and permission, and as Oliver discussed very correctly, the structure of the electricity industry, both in terms of the physical infrastructure but also its management, which is the fundamental limitation, you know, outside of the direct policy questions, which I'll get to sort of at the end. If you look at our contribution to global electricity supply, we would at this stage be, we run these scenarios, we use the IEA new policy scenario now, since that's the central scenario of the World Energy Outlook. Also our moderate scenario, which is the baseline projection that builds upon the 5-year rolling forecast that we do, and then the advanced scenario, which is more in line with the energy revolution, which is based upon our capabilities and under positive policy conditions what we could produce, and we'd look at getting somewhere between 8 and 9% of global electricity supply from wind by 2020 and close to 20 and not quite 20% by 2030. We're somewhat over 4% now. Whether it will be tallied up to be 5% by the end of 2015 remains to be seen. In terms of CO2, these are the quantities of emissions reductions that we have projected. Cumulative CO2 savings of in the vicinity of 8 billion tons, 7.5 to 8 billion tons by 2020, going back to 2007, and then increasing dramatically as the scale of installations continues. I think what we would say is that our moderate scenario is a little bit lower than the remap scenario, and the advanced scenario is a little bit lower than the energy revolution advanced scenario. But again, it's not a lack of technical capability or ability to produce machines or install them or any of the rest of it. It's the policy environment and the electricity system which provide the limitations on how quickly we can grow under ideal conditions. And there's two ways that the deployment can increase. One is through, of course, the policy changes needed to deal with the difficulties in the OECD markets, the traditional markets for wind energy. And that's something mostly my colleagues in the national associations deal with. Our job really is to focus on new markets, and that's the other place where the increased deployment will happen. And I would say in policy terms, our biggest problems are in fact in the established OECD markets, places like the UK, the United States, Australia, and Japan, rather than in the new markets, where of course there are all sorts of problems, but they're all growing, where the others are much more stop and start. The main focus for the past several years has been on Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. Brazil has now entered into the top 10 of cumulative global markets and was the 4th largest annual market last year. Mexico, having undergone a major energy reform, is not very far behind, and they're expecting somewhere around 17,000 megawatts of wind deployed by 2022. And the South African market has taken off under very difficult financial conditions, economic conditions in South Africa, but is now, along with solar PV, actually the only real feasible solution to the electricity crisis that has plagued that country. Elsewhere in Africa, it's a very exciting time. Lots of new markets emerging. I mean, Egypt and Morocco are not really new, but they have a new breath after the pause for the Arab Spring. Egypt has tremendous wind resources, as does Morocco, and both of those markets are developing well. We see strong development in Ethiopia. Africa's largest wind farm will come online in Kenya in 2016, and new projects in Tanzania and Ghana are just the start in the Eastern and West Africa regions. Asia, of course, is where the main action is. Mongolia could supply all of Asia with electricity just from wind and solar PV if it had any way to connect, which it doesn't, of course, at the moment. The Philippines market is moving. Thailand is moving. Pakistan, surprisingly, is moving. Sri Lanka, not very well, although there's enormous potential. The first commercial wind farms are now being built in Indonesia. And the new entrant, assuming that things go well with lifting the sanctions, will be Iran. They have tremendous wind resources. They have a tremendous demand for energy. They have a tremendous demand for clean energy, a strong desire to diversify their energy supply and reduce their dependence upon oil. And I think it could be very exciting. And then the latest developments, really, I mean, we do have a very strong market in Uruguay, where the government there has, with very progressive policies, moved it from almost 0 to almost 40% of their electricity from wind in less than a decade. Chile, the market is finally moving. It's never going to be huge. But very exciting news out of Argentina as a result of the elections, which were held over the weekend, which means that South America's windiest country could now possibly become a viable market if the market reforms that candidate Macri talked about actually come into play. And Argentina's wind resources are enough to supply all of Latin America's energy needs 7 times over, at least. But again, we'll see what happens. So those are the bright spots outside of the OECD. I don't need to go into the, Germany, of course, remains a leader. We've seen positive movement in Canada over the last little while. Scandinavian countries, of course, led by Denmark and Ireland and Portugal. We have problems in Eastern Europe. We have problems in the UK, Australia, and Japan, of course. And that's where we could make, along with these new markets, where we could make the biggest difference in the short term. The 2 big blank spots that are left on the map are the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia. A couple of years ago, there was some hope in both cases that things might start to move there, but recent political developments in both places have meant that what looked like a promising beginning has now come to a rather abrupt halt, and it's back to sticking their head in the sand or the tundra for another few years, and we'll have to wait for that. So basically, we have been on, in terms of our scenario, on the high growth track for most of the last decade, fallen off a bit in the last few years, although the performance in 2014 put us back on the high growth track. But what do we really need to stay there and to fulfill the promise of this technology and to hit the very demanding targets put forward, for instance, in the energy revolution scenario or the remap scenario? Policy stability in the U.S. would probably be the largest single variable in the market. The U.S. actually has the world's shortest term energy planning window. It's extraordinary how much of a political football energy has become, and that would probably be the single greatest thing alongside a global carbon price that would stabilize and allow the industry to develop at maximum potential. China has experienced extraordinary growth in installations, but they're dealing with an only partially liberalized electricity sector, and there are lots of problems in relation to grid certification and quality issues in China that need to be sorted out. Fixing the ETS would be nice. It was a nice idea. It actually got off to a reasonable start at one stage, and we thought it was going to actually start to make a difference after 2012, but for all the well-known reasons, the price has collapsed and it's pointless in terms of stimulating clean energy investment at the moment. It would be relatively easy to fix technically. Politically, I'm told it's very difficult, but I leave that to my European colleagues. Carbon markets we've already spoken about. We have great hopes that something will emerge from Paris that will at least lead us in that direction, although whatever it's going to be, it appears that it won't be something which resembles the flexible mechanisms and the market mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol. They're going to try to do it some other way, but we're not yet clear what that is. And subsidies. As Fatih Birol, the new executive director of the IEA, is fond of saying, governments currently subsidize CO2 emissions globally to the tune of about $110 per ton, which puts a ETS carbon price of less than 10 euros into perspective. That's a difficult subject, which some progress has been made, I think, but nowhere near enough. And we see lots of nice pledges and lots of commitments in the context of the UNFCCC discussions about countries and cities and regions going to 100% renewable energy supply. We see a lot less of the practical steps needed to implement them, but we hope that they will come. So I'll wrap it up there, and hopefully we'll have a little time for discussion at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. And we're running a bit low on time, so I'll introduce first Mr. Gerard Ostheimer from Novozymes. He's the global lead of the Sustainable Energy for All, a sustainable bioenergy group. So please, Gerard, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. As a point of clarification, I don't work for Novozymes. Novozymes, showing tremendous leadership, is sponsoring me to serve as the global lead for sustainable bioenergy for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. So moving on, IRENA in their Remap 2030 painted a pathway or a picture of how we are going to achieve a doubling of the use of renewables, and somewhat to the surprise of everyone, including the bioenergy sector, biomass was seen as making a very significant contribution to the doubling of renewables. I want to point out that bioenergy was seen as contributing to the heating sector, the power sector, and the transportation sector. Our Sustainable Bioenergy Group under Sustainable Energy for All is committed to bringing sustainable bioenergy to all three of those sectors. However, today I am going to focus on the transportation sector because there is a particular activity that I wish to tell you about. So a little bit more on the Sustainable Energy for All Sustainable Bioenergy Group. We are a high impact opportunity within the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. Our ambitions are to promote knowledge enhancement and information sharing, policy and sustainability support, and eventually direct deployment support, which involves properly engaging the financial sector. We seek to drive the deployment of sustainable clean cooking solutions, increased agricultural productivity. I like to say that in a least developed country context, the best bioenergy does not leave the farm until it's food. We're very interested in energy from co-products, wastes, and residues. And on the fuel side, we are looking ahead to fuels that will complement the electrification of personal transport, things like aviation biofuels, maritime, and ethanol and advanced diesels that are coming from cellulosic materials. We are co-chaired by the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. We are very strong on the sustainability side of things, and we are working hard to improve our capacity on the financing side of things. And one of our major ambitions is to change the, unfortunately, frequently misinformed understanding on the relationship between agricultural productivity and the production of sustainable bioenergy. And the UN FAO has been very eloquent on this topic as recently as this summer. As I said, however, we are not the bioenergy group or the sustainable bioenergy group, and we want to build on the great progress that's been made in a variety of institutions, whether FAO, IDB, or the Global Bioenergy Partnership, that has really pulled together a very technically sound approach to sustainable biomass solutions. So looking ahead now to the 2-degree scenario, I want to tell you about an initiative which is the Low Carbon Technology Partnerships Initiative. This has the goal of accelerating the diffusion of existing technologies and developing new technologies, and it's actually across the technology spectrum. This is a joint effort from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the International Energy Agency, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And this group seeks to take the information that exists in the IEA roadmaps and find the business solutions such that we can achieve the 2-degree scenario. And there are a number of focus areas: renewables, which translates to wind and solar, CCS, energy efficiency, etc., climate smart agriculture, forestry, and one of the low carbon technology partnerships is on low carbon transportation fuels. And that's what I want to emphasize today. In the IEA 2050 Blue Map scenario, there was a call for biofuels to be 1/4 of all transportation fuels. On the left, we see a breakdown of how to achieve the 116 exajoules of fuels and the different fuels that are necessary to get there. And what we see is that biofuels is a little over 1/4 of that. And then if you look on the right, we break down the different aspects of transportation that biofuels will be contributing to. We see that there will still probably be a lot of road transport that requires biofuels, but we also see the significant contribution of biofuels to aviation, shipping, and freight. I think that I speak for everyone where if we could shrink that road passenger wedge through increased efficiency and better deployment of renewable, sustainable electrical vehicles, then we all agree that the world would be a better place. All right, so we look at this scenario. How are we going to achieve this net reduction in transport emissions despite the growth of the transport sector? Vehicle efficiency, absolutely fundamental. Alternative fuels, and there's been some very exciting developments in areas such as electrofuels, so taking renewable electricity, using that to convert carbon dioxide back into a liquid hydrocarbon. But there is a role for sustainable biofuels, particularly where energy-dense fuels are needed, such as aviation and heavy transport. If we look at the IEA scenario, we see this rather dramatic demand for new fuels coming online. We see a rather optimistic phasing out of conventional ethanol and conventional biodiesel. Whether or not we can make this scenario, at this point, it does not look like we can. And the reason is that we are not really keeping pace with the anticipated growth. And if you actually look at the growth, it was this extremely optimistic exponential production that would require sort of a rewiring of agriculture on par with the rewiring that's been called for in this webinar on the electricity sector. And, you know, whether or not that can happen, it's actually rather heartening to see the progress that's been made in solar and PV in essentially beating the scenarios. But there's a lot more that goes into creating the sustainable supply chains, and the absolute essentialness of moving forward sustainability. At this point, it looks like we're unlikely to meet these scenarios and to meet the demands. Nonetheless, this low carbon fuels, low carbon technology partnership is made up of a lot of real leaders in this area. DuPont, DSM, these are serious actors in the global chemicals and fuels market. And we see a lot of up-and-coming companies like Brand Bio from Brazil, Joule, Lanzatech, etc. We're actually the sector is as has been noted in some of the statistics earlier, the sector is sort of flatlined, and certainly the bringing online of advanced biofuels has moved much slower than was anticipated 10 years ago. However, there's a fair bit of enthusiasm because we seem to be really turning a corner. Here is shown an example of an advanced ethanol plant where agricultural residues, we're not actually a fan of the term waste, but agricultural residues from wheat or corn can be converted into ethanol, so using the non-food, non-starch part of the plant. And these, you call it these demonstration plants, even though they're commercial size, these demonstration plants are now going up in Brazil. There's 3 in the US, there's the one in Italy, and more are being planned and developed around the world. We see that there are actually a number of technologies and a number of fuel molecules that are being brought online. So in the R&D side, we have some novel fuels and bacterial conversion to sugars to hydrocarbons. We see a lot of demonstration plants now on a variety of technologies, whether pyrolysis, dimethyl ether, cellulosic ethanol, butanol, etc. And then there's already early commercialization of things like hydrotreated vegetable oil. So there's actually a fair number of parallels with the other sectors in terms of what we need to achieve greater deployment. First of all, we need an increased market demand for low-carbon fuels. I think the trajectory, such as the U.S. followed, actually could be repeated around the world, where you start off with some catalytic policies that stay in place until the market matures, and then those policies are removed. There were a number of catalytic policies for ethanol, including tax breaks and import barriers, etc., that have subsequently been removed. But a mandate, clear policy signal of a mandate that is stable is necessary to lead to the investment, to give investors confidence in the stability of the market. So enforced mandates around the world are what is needed. Right now there are less than a handful of mandates that are enforced. There's over 50 mandates in countries around the world, but these are more aspirational, and we need to move them. We need to convince the world that the sustainable biomass is available so that those mandates become confidently enforced. So I'm done, and hopefully we might have a few minutes for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gerard. So we have received an enormous amount of questions, and there's no way we can get through all of them. I'm going to try and send 1 or 2 of them to each of you. So starting with Deger from IRENA, which is about fuels, and the question that is being asked is, what is your opinion on fuels like hydrogen produced by renewable sources such as wind in the transport sector? Do you consider these fuels in the requirements for the transport sector? So basically, what is the role in these scenarios for transport attached to hydrogen? And a related question is, what's the efficiency between the electric engine, the fuel cell engine, and the combustion engine?
Thank you, Christian. Indeed, I mentioned in the presentation mainly about biofuels, conventional and advanced biofuels, but actually the total number of technologies we've considered in the remap analysis according to the country inputs includes actually technologies beyond that. I mentioned that renewable energy share would be about 12% in the sector, in the transport sector by 2030. About 10% of that is related to biofuels, and 2% of that is related to other technologies. That includes electric vehicles, 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, and 4-wheelers, as well as hydrogen and other technologies that is including modal shift, assuming that they are sourced with renewable sources of power. So they make an important contribution, to the total mix of renewable energy fuels in the transport sector, and 10% liquid biofuels, 2% these technologies. The contribution in percent terms looks lower than biofuels, but there's a reason, and that's the answer to your other question, and that's because they are very efficient compared to combustion engines. If you look at an electric vehicle, battery electric vehicle or a plug-in, the efficiency to deliver the same amount of passenger kilometers is 2 to 3 times more efficient than compared to a combustion engine. So with much lower energy, you can deliver same service, plus it's sourced with renewable power. So these technologies are considered, and they have an important role to raise the share of renewables in the transport sector. And one other final benefit next to better efficiency is that they contribute to reducing the local air pollution, which is a trend which we see in many urban areas. So these are definitely considered technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deger. And the next question is to Emily. It's two related questions. The first one is, how will Greenpeace get governments to commit to limiting global warming to 2 degrees? And the separate and related question is, which activities does Greenpeace plan for Paris? I think I know the answer to the second question, because you usually don't just share that prior to the conference, but it's a good question, and I'm sure we would all like to hear the answer to.
Yes, well, I'll certainly answer it to the extent that I'm able to. Greenpeace is working with civil society across the world to create political pressure, both at the Paris conference and in countries around the world, to get governments to commit to a binding agreement that would limit CO2 emission growth so we could stay below the 2-degree target. Our activities in recent weeks have changed in light of the bombings in Paris. So we had planned a large march in Paris that unfortunately, for very good reasons, was canceled. So what we're asking people to do to help us while our team is in Paris is to participate in a local march in your area, calling on governments to act. And our ask for governments at Paris is going to be a binding, legally binding agreement that signals the phase out of fossil fuels and has review targets of every 5 years to make sure that we're staying on track, and of course to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. We have a lot planned for Paris. We have a large team of energy policy experts, activists, volunteers, and campaigners at the conference who will be doing a range of things, perhaps a bit too much to summarize in an answer here, but definitely stay tuned on our Twitter account, Greenpeace International, as well as our website for daily updates and everything that we have planned.
Thank you very much, Emily. And there's a question for Mr. Oliver Schaefer on solar PV. There are in fact a couple of questions. We're trying to lump into 1 or 2 questions. One is that the annual installation seems to need to grow quite dramatically. Under which assumptions can this growth be sustained and even accelerated? Who needs to do what? And in relation to that, there were some sub-questions as well, which was related to your comment that there was no need to predetermine targets. You also said that there was no need, that you need a price on carbon. There's a question here, do you need to ban coal as well? And there's another related question, if costs are so low, why do you need special regimes, if that is what you need? The last question was, are you also tracking distributed PV in terms of statistics, or community or off-grid small PV?
Okay, I can also summarize my answer. Well, yes, there is definitely, a need for increasing the production capacity, which is pretty much on the way. It was on the way the last 10 years, it is on the way now. You saw my projections. I mean, we are now at about 40 plus gigawatt annual production capacity and installation, but we can ramp up that very fast, very quickly, without any problem and any hesitation. Most companies are investing now in scaling up their production facilities. So easily we have more than 60, 70 gigawatt of production capacity within the next couple of years. So that to that answer. And yes, I want to move out from that special regime of determining the growth of renewables or PV or wind or whatsoever into a replacement policy. So let's say we agree on a phase out of coal because this is our biggest challenge. We do replace it with what? And the easy answer is with wind and solar at the first place. But that requires a totally different energy market design. That's where I want to go. And I want to convince, to add on what Emily just said, I want to convince policymakers and decision makers in that respect by saying, like, you guys, you girls, you can now write yourself into history books for the future by making that change a reality. Some politicians made that change already by initiating the growth of renewables 10 years ago, but now change all conditions that were made for a 100 years long system into a new system. This will bring you into history books, so forge the future instead of protecting the past. And this is the way we can convince people, in addition to convincing them by just saying it's the economy stupid. It's cheaper to invest in renewables today than waiting and investing in fossil fuels. So this is what we need to do. And we need to go out of the niche of just setting goals for renewables. No, we are not in that niche anymore, I believe. We are out of the niche. We are a serious player on energy markets, far beyond electricity markets also. As said, in the transport sector, for example, I see electricity as one of the key elements in the future. Hydrogen is pretty inefficient, but doesn't matter when you have wind and solar producing it. Fine as well, but it protects the old infrastructure. So I imagine a totally new world for electricity in the transport sector, for example, with induction charging, red light charging your cars, and everywhere basically you go. And software, smart software, is just making the bills for you. So you don't need to think about it, it's just happening. This is how we change realities and how we convince people. So yes, it is possible, it is feasible, it is happening now. So a further deployment and development of new facilities is happening, it's underway. So all big new companies that are existing already are investing in it. And in addition to that, those companies who are not active on the energy market today, or you don't feel it, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks, and others, they are heavily investing in the energy sector, and they will be part of the future and accelerate this process much further than we believe today.
Thank you, Oliver. And a couple of questions to Steve Sawyer. One is related to Paris. What do you expect coming out of the negotiations in Paris? And related to that, what would you need to come out of Paris in terms of a signal or an incentive for the wind energy sector? So that was the global part, and then there's a national part which relates to your comments on Argentina being potentially able to supply or the entire Latin America, I think you said, and Mongolia. What is needed nationally? So in short, what do you expect and what is needed at a global level, and what is needed nationally to maintain the scenarios that are compatible with staying below 2 degrees?
Well, the short answer is that we don't expect the solution to come out of Paris. I mean, in a sense, it's not a negotiation, is that we already know what the countries are committing to do. They will find plenty of things to fight over, but what we need to come out of Paris is a positive agreement that establishes a framework which is a floor rather than a ceiling, and proceeds hence from that to focus on what is called work stream 2, which is the action to be taken before we get to 2020, because of course whatever we agree in Paris, or whatever governments agree, the one thing that is clear is that it won't come into force until sometime in 2020. That's assuming it gets sufficient sign-on. So I think a robust agreement which is clearly designed as a floor rather than a ceiling, which has strong mechanisms for revisiting the question as we move forward. Because the reality is that for many, many years, I and many others worked on the climate issue with the expectation that we were going to create a global framework which would set the bar for what we're going to do. But what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is precisely the opposite, is that industry and society and business is moving much faster than governments. So we have to adapt to that new reality and make sure that their plans at worst case scenario don't get in the way. Best case scenario help to provide the kind of incentives. Have more or less given up on the notion of a global carbon market as was envisaged under the Kyoto Protocol. It's still not impossible, I suppose, but it's going to come about much more through the linking of existing national schemes, national and regional schemes. So anything that they can do to facilitate that would be a very useful thing. And in terms of Argentina and Mongolia, in terms of first it's domestic policies, and in the case of Mongolia, of course, making peace with their very large neighbors to the north and south, the Russian Federation on the north and China on the south, in order to provide them an access to get their electricity to market, and then building the infrastructure which would make that able to happen. And in Argentina, they have some fairly serious macroeconomic problems which were created by the governments over the last, well, most of the last 75 years, before which Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. There's no reason why it shouldn't be again. They have everything, including, as I mentioned, some of the best wind resources. They already have a strong interconnection with Uruguay, and through that to Brazil. That would need to be strengthened, and of course across the Andes to Chile, where there is a tremendous demand for cheap electricity and where wholesale prices remain over $100 a megawatt hour, where wind is, and Argentinian wind would be 1/20th of that or thereabouts. So in the short answer, those are the first steps would need to be national policy. In the larger thing, of course, there are Mr. Son from SoftBank in Japan, who runs the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, has launched a vision of a East Asia supergrid based upon the tremendous renewable resources in Mongolia in particular. It'll be a long time before that comes to be a reality, but physical and strong economic ties between the countries in the region, much like in the early days of the European Union, would go a long way towards helping to prevent World War III and create the kind of economic relationships and interdependence which would hopefully make the outbreak of hostilities in that part of the world unthinkable. So, short answer to potentially very large questions.
Very large questions and answers indeed. The last question is for Gerard. It's a bit long, so bear with me, but I think it's a very good question. Biofuel is the main alternative to fossil fuels. Electric vehicles are promising, but even with high deployment, their contribution to total renewable energy share is limited. Today, investment for liquid biofuels are very low. Advanced biofuel pathways are emerging, but install capacity remains very low. I think you would say that we need to multiply by 100, Gerard. And the question is, in light of this, how will it be possible to realize the remap estimates or pathways, especially if the world continues to be on a low crude oil price pathway?
Well, thank you for that thoughtful question, and certainly as we look at the entrenched way that fossil fuels are entrenched in the transportation sector, we really need to take the approach of literally rewiring how we think about distributing power and energy to personal mobility. And that large redistribution can only really happen through a effective and forward-leaning collaboration between the public and private sectors. So if we look in the United States, we see states like California taking a leadership role, emphasizing creating the infrastructure to get more electrical vehicles out there, but then in parallel creating their own low carbon fuel standard. And I think that biofuels are where wind and solar were 15 or 20 or maybe even more years ago. But there are these deployable technologies, and the fundamental need is we need to overcome the chicken or the egg problem that is somewhat idiosyncratic to the biofuels. You know, there's no problem if you're going to build a wind turbine of recruiting someone to provide the parts. Whereas there's this need to convince not only investors but also farmers of the benefits of providing or changing their landscape management techniques to bring new feedstocks online. And as I always emphasize, the essentiality of making these feedstocks sustainable. So there's this chicken or the egg problem where an investor is not going to facilitate the development of a biorefinery unless there's feedstocks, but the farmer is not going to provide the feedstocks unless there's a customer. And if you look at actually the Defense Production Act in the United States, which is aimed around providing aviation biofuels, that was the issue that they tried to overcome. But again, you have to generate these very synergistic, very complementary alignments between a committed long-term policy and criticize the RFS as long as you want or as much as you want. But in many regards, it's provided a significant stability to the market. So what we need is this real synergy and this commitment to a long-term solution, whether it's bringing electric vehicles online, providing them the infrastructure, bringing blender pumps online across the world the way that Brazil did, or breaking the impasse between sustainable feedstocks and newer technologies, as was done by the Defense Production Act. So the fact that we have these examples, there is a way to move forward, but it requires a tremendous amount of energy and vision and commitment. So there's a long answer to a long question.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Unfortunately, we don't have much more time. We are already over time. I'd just like to thank you, Deger, Saygin from IRENA, Emily Rochon from Greenpeace, and Oliver Schaefer from Solar Power Europe, Steve Sawyer from the Global Wind Energy Council, and Gerard Ostheimer, Global Lead Sustainable Energy for All, Sustainable Bioenergy Group. Of course, also thank you to the IRENA staff, Ginny, Carlo, and Ismail here for organizing all this. And thanks for all the questions as well. I'm just going to hand over before we end to Ismail with a couple of practical announcements. Thank you very much for your participation today.
Thank you. So we hope you enjoyed the webinar and found it useful. We'd like to learn from your feedback, so if you stay tuned, you will receive now a notification for feedback, which we would be very happy if you gave us. And after that, the webinar will be concluded, and we invite you to follow IRENA at on our sites and our social media outlets as well. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely evening.